Hey everyone, welcome to this week's reading of Empire of Serpents with myself and pdmac as usual. And we are picking up with 17 and 18. We've got 4 chapters left, so we're closing in on the conclusion of this thing. So I'll go ahead and just jump into it. Chapter 17, Gwen. Grimar lifted the axe above his head, and his body began to glow with the same light as his weapon. Heat and power radiated from him, so powerful that Gwen had to use her might rune just to stay on her feet. Even then, it was almost too much. When he spoke, the words rolled over her like a thunderclap. Gwen covered her ears against the sound, tears streaking down her cheeks. He took a step toward her, and the ground trembled with his power. The building shook around them, and Gwen knew that she would not survive against him. In a blur of movement, she dropped down and retrieved her blade, then tried to stab Grimar in the stomach as she came back up. There was a clang of metal as Grimar's axe blocked her sword. He rotated his wrist, locking her blade against the axe head and the handle, and jerked back. Gwen's sword was ripped from her grasp, and it went sailing away, clattering to the ground somewhere behind Grimar. Before she could react, Grimar backhanded her. She flew backward, striking the wall again with a crunch, then bounced off to the ground. She didn't know for sure, but she thought some of her ribs were broken. Gwen whispered the word legis. The magic began healing her, but it was a slow process. Gwen lurched to her feet, pushing the pain into the back of her mind. She matched Grimar's intense stare. I'm going to die, she thought. And then she rushed him, lifting her left hand. She got close enough to touch his chest before letting off a blast of lightning. Grimar grunted as he was thrown backward from the concussive force. Thin trails of smoke rose from his robes, but otherwise he seemed unfazed. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Most of the mages I killed cowered and begged for their life. I don't beg, Gwen snapped. We'll see. Grimar stomped his right foot down. The cobblestones of the street heaved upward, forcing Gwen off balance. She staggered and tried to keep from rolling her ankle, quickly diving aside. She tumbled a few times, then got back up. Grimar was there in the blink of an eye, his glowing axe coming straight at her head. Gwen used her rune speed and stepped out of the way just in time, the air from his swing brushing the side of her face. She dropped to one knee and used her other leg to spin herself around. Using the might rune, she drove her fist into the back of Grimar's leg, just behind his knee. To her surprise, it worked. The blow forced his leg to bend and he fell forward onto the ground. She stood and leaped into the air, intending to land on him and use her drain life rune. She crashed to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs. Grimar was already gone. She rolled onto her back and saw him standing over her, the axe poised inches from her neck. This has been fun, but I've got a rebellion to crush, he said. The madness in his eyes had intensified, and Gwen wondered for the briefest moment whether or not he was possessed by some foul spirit. The axe rose and fell, and Gwen snapped her eyes shut, not wanting to see her death coming. Something heavy landed on her, and there was a clang. Gwen opened her eyes to see Kalen's face above hers, his excited grin plastered across his lips. If you want me on top of you, all you had to do was ask, he said with a chuckle. And then he was pulled off her as Grimar grabbed him by the back of his shirt, flinging Kalen across the courtyard. Gwen didn't worry about him. His stone skin rune could take the beating. Gwen rolled out of Grimar's range and got up, her ribcage burning with fire. Menjing and the others were there too. They quickly encircled Grimar, closing off any escape. You're outnumbered, Menjing said. Give up or die. Grimar turned a slow circle, looking at each mage, and then he laughed. Fools, this battle is already won. Grimar tossed his axe aside, but instead of falling to the ground, it spun end over end through the air and cut down 3 of the mages. Their forms crumpled, puddles of blood rapidly growing around them. The axe landed in one of the puddles, and the glowing intensified. Gwen stared in horror. With barely any effort, he'd slain 3 people. He was a monster, and he was unstoppable. No one is unstoppable, Lyra's voice echoed in her mind. Even dragons can be killed. And apparently, they could read minds without permission. Gwen looked at the axe as it began to shake. Then it flew through the air of its own accord, striking down another 2 mages. Those who remained used their runes to erect barriers around themselves. Gwen wished she'd taken a rune like that, and as if in answer, Kalen appeared at her side and used his barrier rune to protect them both. Grimmer held his hand out, and the axe returned, and he gripped the hilt, and it vanished. Enough games, he growled. Grimmer lifted his arms into the air and clenched his hands into fists. The ground rumbled, and the sky began to darken with unnatural black clouds. A myriad of lightning bolts dropped from the heavens, striking everyone and everything within the circle of mages. Cries of anguish and surprise rang out as the blast cracked and shattered some of the barriers, killing those within. Dust and smoke blotted out everything. Gwen coughed and covered her face with her arm, peering vainly into the swirling chaos. A dark shape came toward her, swift and silent. Gromar's face appeared in front of the barrier, and Gwen screamed involuntarily, scrambling back. He cackled in response, every laugh laced with his insanity. Kaelin's shield was still intact, but Grimar tapped it with his finger, and it flickered and died. Kaelin stepped in front of him, blocking Gwen. He tried to summon his spike ball of energy, but Grimar grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Kaelin clawed at Grimar's hands, his feet kicking wildly in the air as he was strangled. Gwen used her might rune and quickly placed one hand on Grimar's wrist and the other on his elbow. She pulled back on his wrist and pushed his elbow in the opposite direction. There was an audible crack as Grimar's bones broke. Gwen felt bile rising into her throat and swallowed, forcing it back down. Grimar's grasp on Kaelin's neck was released, and he staggered to the side, gasping. Grimar hadn't flinched. He pulled his broken arm close to his body and lifted his other arm toward Gwen. His palm glimmered briefly, and then a blast of cold air sent Gwen reeling. She shivered uncontrollably, and her teeth chattered. She felt as if she'd suddenly been thrown into winter. Her lips barely moved for her to call on her fire rune, and the word came out as nothing more than a whisper. Flames roared from her right hand, striking the ground around her feet. The heat warmed her and pushed the cold away, enabling her to direct the flames at Grimar. He came at her anyway, the flames casting themselves aside from his presence. Gwen cut the magic off and hit him with another lightning bolt as he reached her, his hand going for her throat. The blast knocked him back a few steps, but he recovered quickly and came right back at her. Grimar snatched her up by the neck as he had with Kaelin. She gasped as her vision exploded with lights. Grimar squeezed hard, but Gwen managed to wheeze the name of her might rune. A wave of strength flooded her body, strengthening her enough to keep him from crushing her windpipe. She kicked at him vainly, the blows accomplishing nothing. Behind Grimar, the smoke had cleared to reveal the massacre. Many of the mages were dead, their bodies nothing more than smoldering lumps of charred flesh. Darkness was creeping around the edges of Gwen's vision, but she forced herself to look at the destruction, to burn the sight into her memory. The gruesomeness fueled her somehow, giving strength to the dark rune. Gwen clutched Grimar's hand. Draen's cell, she whispered. Grimar's eyes widened. The madness was still there, but Gwen spotted something else. Fear. He tried to release her, but the dark rune would not be refused. It kept him rooted in place, siphoning the life and vitality from him. The energy filled Gwen, renewing her. The healing rune flared within her mind, and her ribs healed instantly. Grimar's strength was fading, and he dropped to his knees. Gwen pulled his hand away from her throat, but she didn't let go of him. She would not show him mercy as she had with Amel. Grimar tried to speak, but all that came out of his mouth was garbled noise. Blood flecked his lips as he gagged, the more and more trailed from his nostrils. His eyes shrank into his head, and his skin became loose. He aged rapidly before her eyes, but she didn't feel revulsion this time. She felt pleasure. You will never again cause torment, she hissed, watching as the look in his eyes became pleading. Gwen clenched her jaw and forced the rest of the energy from his body. The life in his eyes faded, and only then did she let go of him. She stood over his lifeless form for a long while in silence. She expected to feel guilt or shame for taking his life with the dark rune. Instead, she felt nothing at all. Her emotions were completely absent, her heart hollow and empty. There was movement beside her, and she slowly became aware of Kaelin's voice. She looked at him blankly. "We're not finished yet," he said. Gwen looked past him and saw a group of robed figures coming toward them, and they didn't look like allies. She nodded at Kaelin and pushed past him. She took a few steps and stopped, waiting calmly. "What are you doing?" Kaelin asked. "Get inside my shield." She ignored him. Torian's followers would never stop, whether they were under the influence of magic or some distorted sense of loyalty she didn't know, nor did she care. All she knew was that death was never satisfied, and neither was the dark rune. It was pulsing across every inch of her body, begging to release the energy it had consumed. Gwen didn't think, she just reacted, letting the rune guide her. The nearest mage was torn to pieces by a swarm of shadows. Another was sucked into a dark hole that had no end. Gwen tore through their ranks methodically and sadistically. She forced a man to pick up a sword and impale himself. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she was no longer in control of anything. The dark rune dictated her moves, her thoughts. She touched a woman and gave her a disease that ate her alive as Gwen watched. If she was to become a monster, then this was how she wanted it, a tool of justice, dealing out death to those who deserved it. The remaining mage fell to the last of the dark rune's energy. Her skin flayed from her body while she was still alive. As the power of the rune faded, Gwen slowly started to feel like herself again. She surveyed the carnage wordlessly. Had she really killed Grimar and his mages by herself? She turned around and saw Kalen. He was staring at her as if she were a creature he'd never seen before. Where's Connell? She asked, looking to the castle. Is he inside the castle? Kalen didn't answer. He just continued to stare at her. Gwen walked toward him. She thought he was going to run away from her, but he stayed where he was. She reached him and wrapped her arms around him, then broke into tears. Kalen hesitantly hugged her back.
Chapter 18, Connell. Sword in hand, Torian slowly rose from the throne. That you made it this far speaks persistence. He snorted a derisive laugh. Though, do you really think your presence here is because you're some great warrior? Does it matter? Connell shot back, taking measure of the man. I'm here. Torian descended the stairs in slow, casual steps. Expecting to see him in royal garb, Connell frowned in surprise to see him dressed for combat, but then figured it was illogical since Havengard was under attack. And then he remembered this man was his father's brother. Was there a resemblance? You're here because I wanted to see you for myself. Torian's voice was firm and strong. Come closer, let me look at you. Connell strode half the distance to Torian, studying him as he approached. The dark beard and hair were flecked with gray. He wore a thin circlet of gold with an emerald in the shape of an eagle in the center. For all Torian's bravura, Connell noticed the occasional shimmer of chainmail below the sleeveless tunic of thick leather. Connell smirked to himself. The man was taking no chances. Still, the muscular arm said he had not been idle these past 20 years. Well, uncle, Connell said, here I am. It was then he noticed that Torian's arms were covered in runes. Come closer. Why don't you come here? As you wish. Torian touched his speed rune and in an instant was upon Connell, who stepped aside just as Torian's downstroke swung at him. On instinct, Connell raised the sword above his head and felt the heavy clang of Torian's second strike. He bent down and swirled, his sword outstretched, hoping to catch Torian's legs. But all he felt was empty air. Instinct had him leap and roll as Torian's sword banged against the floor. Torian came at him with a flurry of thrusts and jabs, forcing him backwards. Yet with each parry, Connell noticed the force of Torian's strikes seemed to lessen. Abruptly, Torian stopped his attack and gave Connell a haughty stare. You fight well. I'm impressed. In a surprised move, he turned his back on Connell and walked back toward the center of the room, then turned to face him. He shook his head at his nephew and sneered. You don't have the heart to command. I gave you opportunity to attack me from behind, and you simply let me walk away. Only cowards attack from behind, Connell retorted. Cowardice has nothing to do with it. It's called opportunity. You take advantage whenever it appears. That's what kings do. No, that's what you do. A true king doesn't have to rule by fear and intimidation. A true king is loved by his subjects. No one loves you. Torian's arrogant smile vanished. Bold words from a whelp with no experience. Experience has nothing to do with it. Truth is truth. It's a fool who won't accept truth. Torian's nostrils flared, and he composed himself. Did you come here to bore me to death? No, Connell firmly replied. I came here for restitution. Death is merely the end state. And you have greatly erred, for it is you who will die. I guess we'll see, won't we? You've forgotten one very important point, Torian mocked. Oh? Pointing to his crown, he said, you see the stone of the eagle? I'm sure you've been told the prophecy. I have. The eagle will bear the viper in his claws. You know that I am the eagle. You and your pathetic sisters are vipers, though that has stretched the imagination a bit. But The result is that you two lose. Connell sniffed in derision. You've conveniently left out the most important part. From the west, a cobra will rise and strike down the eagle. Connell jerked up his sleeve, revealing the cobra brand on his shoulder, the brand now dazzling tattoo of shimmering greens and gold. Torian stiffened, exclaiming, Impossible! Energized, Connell closed the gap between them, attacking a surprised Torian, who found himself pressed backwards before parrying and delivering counter blows. The two opponents traded strikes and jabs, circling around the throne room floor as the battle progressed. I'm surprised you haven't called for reinforcements, Connell taunted as they exchanged blows. Or would that be admitting your weakness? Weakness, Torian roared, arcing down a powerful hit that Connell easily blocked. I should have killed you when I had the chance. You said that before, Connell mocked. But then, I suppose that's what you're good at, killing babies and women. With an angry growl, Torian increased his attack, his frustration growing that Connell simply blocked or deflected each strike, yet didn't attack himself, as though he was toying with them. At the same time, he felt his strength giving way and silently cursed Grimmer for convincing him he didn't need the strength room, that he was strong enough, and besides, he had others to do his bidding. But what about all the other runes he had on his body? An image flashed of the excruciating pain he endured accepting the speed rune. Truth was, he had nearly died. Only Grimmer's administration saved him. But these other runes? Grimmer convinced him he didn't need fighting runes, that he was powerful enough as he was. What he needed was mystical and magic runes, runes about insight and knowledge. None of the magic runes had worked. In that instant, facing his nemesis, the epiphany burst, and he realized that all the runes he had in his body were nothing more than sugar pills meant to placate him. He had seen what happened to others who demanded rune marks only to horribly suffer and die, so they were not mage marked. But surely he was mage marked. He had to be. He was the king. Doubt creeped in, and Torian knew he needed time to regroup, to come up with a plan to destroy his brother's kids. Where was Grimmer? He was supposed to be here. What was taking him so long? Sensing indecision, Connell pressed a furious attack, his strength rune dominating the weakening Torian. Suddenly, Torian delivered a series of strikes that momentarily caught Connell on the defense. He was about to step back when Torian spun around and fled towards the rear of the room behind the throne podium. Surprised at the retreat, Connell reached to his pocket and retrieved a throwing star. He had never used one before, but now seemed like a good time. Praying that the rune mark worked, he flung it at Torian just as he opened a secret door in the wall. Torian let out a startled grunt of pain as a star tore into his thigh, causing him to stumble and drop to his knees. By the time Connell had raced across the room, Torian had managed to stand and stagger through the opening. Connell stuck a foot in the doorway to prevent its closing. Yanking it open, he stepped to the broad landing with 5 sets of spiral stairs, 3 ascending and 2 descending, Torian nowhere in sight. Thankful for the embedded glowstones, Connell rapidly scanned the landing, thinking that with Torian wounded, it should be easier to descend than climb. Glancing down to the floor, he hoped for a telltale sign of blood, but there was none. It wasn't until he checked the second descending staircase that he saw the throwing star on the ground and the bloodied handprint on the railing. Descending the stairs brought him to a long hallway lit with glowstones. Torian was halfway down, hand to the wall for support, dragging his left leg. Blood continued seeping from a deep gash in the back of his thigh. Connell was on him in an instant, bypassing him, then spinning around to confront him. We haven't finished. Torian looked up at him, a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. Inhaling a deep breath, he leveled a paternal stare at Connell. You just don't understand. Your father was tearing apart everything our family had spent hundreds of years building. You think I wanted his death? He just wouldn't listen. I had to do something. Murder my entire family? Connell retorted. That wasn't my fault. Some individuals I called friends thought they were doing me a favor. I found out too late. Surely you believe me. Doubt slipped into Connell's determination as Torian's voice had a calming effect. What about my family in Irving? I knew nothing about that, Torian said, his voice soothing and melodious. As soon as I found out, I had the perpetrators executed. Really? Connell lowered his sword. Yes, I know you believe me. Now come, help me get to a physician. Connell took a step forward when a voice rang out. Liar. Torian turned as Connell looked past his shoulder to see Madeline storming up the hallway, Corla on her heels. Liar. Madeline again exclaimed. She stared at Connell. Can't you see he's using his voice to sway you? She snapped her head to glare at Torian. You're just like Haggard, smooth tongue, all mouth and no brains. Shut up, woman, Torian seethed. Why are you here? You're supposed to be helping Grimmer. Grimmer doesn't need my help, she replied, then pointed her finger at Connell. Besides, he needs to hear the truth from you, the man who killed his family. Torian flipped his sword up to stab her, only to have it deflected by Connell's blade. Torian twisted his head to look at him, pitiful eyes pleading for understanding. I'm your uncle, your own flesh and blood. Connell felt a surge of guilt and stepped back. Stop it, Madeline scolded. He's using an emotion voice rune. Don't listen to her. Torian continued, his legs throbbing. She's a traitor. You can't trust her. Listen to me. You need to help me. You shouldn't have hurt me like you did. I'm sorry. Frowning, Connell gazed down at his sword as though he couldn't understand how it came to be in his hands. His first inclination was to toss it to the floor, but that didn't seem right. Does it hurt? Madeline interrupted, smacking Torian's wound. The gods damn you, woman! Torian roared, cringing in pain as he awkwardly stepped away. In that instant, Torian's voice spell broke, and Connell woke to his surroundings. At the same time, Corliss stepped around Madeline and placed a hand on Torian's shoulder. Here, let me help you. Klorak Abbas. Expecting the pain to subside and the wound to heal, Torian waited, but a few moments before excoriating her. That didn't do anything, you stupid woman. Ah, well, Corliss shrugged. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Torian felt the point of Connell's sword at his side. Turning his head to face him, he used his most persuasive voice. Those two are thorns in our sides. You need to get me to a physician. Then we need to talk about co-ruling. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Connell barked a laugh. Co-ruling? Are you serious? You're not ruling anything anymore. Torian's eyes blinked wide, and he refocused his voice. But you want to rule with me. I'm your uncle. You'd never want to harm me. What gave you that idea? Connell challenged. I've come to end this, remember? Madeline shifted a glass at Corla, dipping her head in respect. You two need to step away, Connell told the two mages, before turning his full attention to Torian. Like I said, it's time to end this. Dumbfounded, Torian stared at them before tossing his sword to the floor. Glaring defiantly at Connell, he said, I won't fight you. You have to kill an unarmed man. Just like you killed my unarmed family in Hervé? Connell retorted, swinging his blade. Connell dodged the attack, grabbing his sword in the process, before limping back several steps, then turning to force his legs to carry him down the hallway. Connell let him go until Torian was almost to the far door at the end. Withdrawing another throwing star, he whipped it down the hall with such intensity that it completely sliced through the chainmail, embedding itself in Torian's back, propelling him forward to crash into the door. Stay here, Connell ordered the two mages. An instant later, he stood over the prostrate body of his uncle, who was struggling to push himself to his knees. Connell patiently waited until Torian sat on his haunches, blood gushing out the wound on his back. Any last words? Connell coldly asked. Go to hell, he snarled, spitting blood. Not very original, Connell taunted, but they'll do. Remember this? He pulled back the sleeve to show the Cobra band. It will be the last thing you remember. In a powerful stroke, he sliced through Torian's neck. Torian's head momentarily wavered before rolling forward and down to the floor. His body sat back and slowly flopped to the side. Though watching, Connell stared down at his uncle. Madeline spoke to Corla. That was very clever of you, dearie. Thank you, Corla smiled. It was all I could think of at the moment. Where did you learn the spell to counter rune voice? A voice rune. It was one of those things I was taught. Never thought I'd ever use it. Madeline turned to her and placed a gentle hand on her arm. You're going to be a great mage, dearie. Corliss studied the older mage. Were you really working for us all along? How else do you think he and all the others knew what was going on? She turned back to gaze at Connell. He's going to need our help. I'll have to undo all of Torian's wickedness. That'll take time. And of course, there's dragons to consider.
All right. We got 2 chapters left to wrap it up, and that video will be next week. So make sure you are subscribed and getting the notifications when the new videos come up. So with that said, till next week. See you guys.